couple of months ago, I started my second playthrough of Rockstar's single-player role-playing game, Red Dead Redemption 2. When the game first released back in 2018, it was met with universal praise by critics and players alike. In many people's eyes, it became an instant classic. A masterpiece of story, characters, visuals, music, and gameplay, all packed into an extensive and almost endless experience. And despite losing out on Game of the Year at the Game Awards to God of War that December, many people still consider it to be amongst one of the greatest video games ever made. I myself picked up my own copy of the game right around the initial release period, and although I enjoyed my time with the title and ultimately enjoyed the experience, I felt a noticeable disconnect of how everyone else felt about the game and how I did. I enjoyed the story and characters, and I really felt the thrill of emulating a morally questionable protagonist in the Wild West. But I kept feeling there was a limit to my enjoyment of the game. When people online would talk about how immersive and dynamic the gameplay was or how incredible the story felt, I would feel like I was missing something. I kept waiting to get to that moment in the game where I would suddenly feel it, that life-altering moment that the game had seemed to deliver to others. I looked for a story beat or a mission or some visual achievement that would suddenly make it all clear and raise the game from good to great. And yet, it never came. I would hear reviewers and friends talk about how the game came at just the right time in their life, or how attached they felt to one of the members of the gang, or even how meditative they found just riding around in the open world. And whilst I saw glimpses of this during my playthrough, my experiences seemed to never reach the same heights of euphoria and enjoyment. Instead, I spent the majority of my playthrough with an overwhelming feeling of frustration and disappointment. And ever since that first playthrough, I had this constant question in the back of my mind as to why I felt like that about a game that was so beloved. And so, I wanted to give the game another shot, and decided to play it again. As I said earlier, my first attempt to play Red Dead was around the time the game first came out. I had followed the hype surrounding the game for years and always been a pretty big fan of most things Rockstar makes. Despite my limited time with the other Red Dead games, I had always been intrigued by the American West and the idea of running around emulating a spaghetti western and doing my best impression of Clint Eastwood. So when the game finally released and I heard the amazing reviews, I decided to pick up my own copy and dive headfirst into the world. Whilst I enjoyed my experience with the game as a whole, there was this constant cloud over my journey through the game, and I thought a lot of it boiled down to the little things that I just didn't like about it. I've played Rockstar games for a long time. I know there's a certain amount of charm, shall we say, in how a lot of the games feel and control. I know to some people this is something they actively like about the Rockstar games. This heaviness and slow, obtuse movements that I think are supposed to feel real or at least to add weight and heft behind them. But for me, this often makes them feel so tiring and laborious to play. There comes a point after playing for 20, 50, or 100 hours of a game that these over-accentuated and inaccurate movements begin to feel obstructive to enjoying and playing. I can't really explain it in any other way other than a constant bad taste in my mouth whilst trying to love the rest of the game. Like I'm biting into a delicious piece of fruit with a toothache that stops me from being able to take in anything else but the pain. Completing a mission or activity is accompanied with a layer of frustration, not because of what you're actually doing, but because of the environment in which you're doing it. Movements so often felt misplaced, doorways felt like a struggle to enter. I would be roaming the vast plains of the beautiful world Rockstar created, and suddenly be tripped up by some rogue piece of terrain. I know these things seem mild on the surface, but I vividly remember my time with Red Dead 2 being absolutely plagued with all of these issues. The escapist fantasy I'd been promised felt like another way to annoy and aggravate me. The annoying controls, combined with the heavy story and huge cast of characters, made it very hard to keep committing time and energy to the game. But clearly other people were getting on just fine with it. Maybe they had some issues here or there, but I don't think it was stopping them from enjoying the game entirely. So why was I feeling all of these annoyances so greatly? Everyone has their own irritations with games or books or whatever it is they're doing in that moment. Sometimes they can be totally justified, or be a bit petty, but either way they can detract from the experience for some if they're that invasive. Unfortunately for me, when playing Red Dead Redemption 2, I couldn't ignore my frustrations long enough to appreciate the actual game. And this isn't anything to do with the product or the developers behind it. Sometimes you're just not in the right state of mind to really take in and enjoy a piece of media. Maybe you're going through a rough time in your life and you can't enjoy things you normally would. Or maybe you've grown out of the interest you used to have, but Whatever the reason, it can be really disheartening when all you want to do is take your mind off the bad stuff and enjoy yourself. I've had my fair share of things going on in my life over the last few years, that whether I realised it or not, affected how I was enjoying a lot of things. And when I started Red Dead Redemption 2 in late 2018, it maybe wasn't the right time in my life to start something as big as that when I wasn't feeling 100%. Now some of you may have completely conflicting opinions of that notion. I know a friend of mine who was going through a tough time during their first playthrough of Red Dead Redemption 2 and found the game to be tremendously cathartic and comforting as they grieved the loss of someone close to them. But for me, I think when I feel disconnected or down or not myself, starting something big and new like an open world role-playing game can be a daunting and frankly scary task as opposed to being a form of escapism. You see this a lot in people's watching habits on Netflix, and they'll constantly rewatch a show over and over again as a source of comfort, instead of starting something new that could be even better than what they already know. Unfortunately, the act of starting something can be more challenging than it has any real right to be. I think I had encountered this idea a lot in my life up until this point, but I always put it down to not gelling with a piece of entertainment or disliking things about it. But I think in reality I just wasn't in a good place myself to fully enjoy and consume something heavy like a massive 50-hour game. I think a game, like any other medium, can be perceived in vastly different ways. Not just by different people, but by the same person at different times in their lives. Something you hated as a kid can take on an entirely different meaning as you get older, and something you used to love no longer interests you in the same ways it once did. Earlier this year I started to feel a little better mentally, and back to what I would like to think is my normal self. And although I wouldn't say I was totally happy and content, for the first time in several years I felt a change in my attitude and outlook. After several years in university, COVID, and dealing with other personal issues, I felt like I was kind of turning a corner and starting to feel more myself and generally happier again. It felt like a real change was happening in my life after some pretty tough years of feeling like I was getting nowhere. All of this change led to me feeling dramatically different when working, and when doing things for fun in my spare time. Games began to feel more enjoyable, and I felt myself being able to let go of stresses and worries and truly enjoy things again. During this time I did a lot of introspective thinking about where I'd been mentally, and where I was in that moment. And the thoughts and feelings that had seemed to be buried deep in my mind for so long were finally being released to allow for new ones to come in and take their place. Noticing this, I wanted to finally tackle my backlog of games that had gone unplayed during my time at university. Over the previous years I had tried to start a number of games, but often found myself quickly feeling bored and disconnected from what I was playing. When I looked through the list of titles that I'd had this experience with, one in particular stood out. Red Dead Redemption 2 had sat on my shelf for almost 4 years at that point. I could remember the rough outline of the story, but very few specifics, and yet I had this urge to dive right back in. This world that a former self had rejected so harshly now seemed to call for me as though it were my second home waiting for me to return to where I belonged. So I installed the game, did some updates, downloaded my save file, and suddenly I was back in the Wild West. I had left the game in the epilogue feeling like I had seen enough of what it had to show me to call it quits and move on to the next adventure. But seeing as I had little recollection of what had actually happened in the game, I wanted to start afresh on a new save. And so I did. I think a lot of people kind of accept that the game starts slowly. There's a lot of characters to introduce, and the setting of a snowstorm up in the mountains is not necessarily the easiest place to get a grasp on who's who and what's going on. But on this second playthrough, I really felt like I was getting to truly know these characters and the plights that had and would face them. Obviously I had the advantage of knowing roughly who people were, but all my frustration and annoyance from my initial playthrough felt completely absent and frankly unwarranted. The characters felt engaging and interesting, the plot exciting, and the general feel of the game felt so much more approachable and stress-free. Missions that bored or irritated me originally felt like epic tales of murder, betrayal, and money. Characters who had barely made an impression on me the first time around were some of the richest I'd come across in any game. It felt like an entirely different experience the first time I'd played, and the effect it had on me was much more potent and closer to those original summations made by online reviewers and friends. I finally was seeing the game everyone else had been playing all this time, but the only thing that was different from then to now was me. My mood had changed, I had an openness to the gameplay and story, and ultimately I felt I had changed as a person. The stressed and distracted kid who had played it nearly 4 years earlier was almost entirely gone, replaced with a more focused and willing participant ready to really enjoy the experience of a big adventure. I felt the story that had been created. I lived the fantasy of a lone rider on the plains of the West. Felt touched by what I was witnessing, cared truly and deeply about each and every one of the members of the gang. I felt every betrayal and twist in the story as though they were happening to me personally. Where previously my experience was bogged down with my own issues and frustrations, now I was able to savour every moment the game served to me. I felt so absent during the first time around, and now I was truly present, taking in everything the game had to give. I finally felt I had reached the right moment in my life to play the game, and that might sound kind of odd and pretentious, but it's truly how I felt. It's as if my subconscious knew that I wasn't ready for it before, but now that I had grown and changed, I was willing to accept it wholeheartedly. The veil of issues that I thought I had with the game evaporated, and I was confronted with the reality of a masterpiece before me. Something that I could have missed entirely had I not given the game a second chance. And that's really why I wanted to make this video. It's a strange phenomenon, and maybe this isn't a normal experience for most people, but it felt like such a significant moment for myself that I wanted to share it in the slim chance that someone may have experienced something similar. Games and any kind of media can affect us deeply whether we want them to or not. They can alter our moods and reveal things we didn't know about ourselves, but only if we're ready for them to do so. This readiness is not easily found, and often can't be manufactured or forced, but when it presents itself it can open us to a whole spectrum of experience. When I played Red Dead Redemption 2 for the first time in 2018, I wasn't the person I am today. Although I didn't realise it at the time, I wasn't ready for that kind of game at that moment in my life. Coming back to it years later, I found an entirely new perspective and appreciation for a game that I had written off as not for me. It felt like a strong personal lesson in how I feel mentally, but also a reminder that tastes and interests are ever growing and changing, and something that I may have completely dismissed previously can have a profound impact on me further down the road. I thought I would never play Red Dead Redemption 2 again after I completed it the first time, but this whole journey of discovering something that was right in front of me has made me hungry and curious to pursue other games or media that I had previously dismissed. Have you ever experienced finding a game at the right moment in your life? Or perhaps the right game at the wrong moment? Even if it was something completely unrelated to games, has there ever been something you tried to like or get into at a younger age that you found again later on and were able to enjoy? I think it's such an interesting idea, and I'm really interested to hear your opinions on the matter. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a like, comment down below to give your input on the discussion, and subscribe to catch future videos from the channel.